when a letter arrived telling them they'd inherited a cabin buried under 12 feet of snow in the mountains. Everyone said to sell it sight unseen, that it was worthless, that the trip alone would kill them. But when they finally dug through that frozen door and found the hidden room sealed behind the stone fireplace, what lay inside wasn't just shelter from the cold. It was $234 million in diamonds, and a secret that would test everything they believed about honesty, survival, and doing the right thing. Before we explore this incredible journey, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The radiator in the corner of the apartment clanked and hissed, but it barely pushed warmth into the small living room where Margaret Hayes sat hunched over the kitchen table. Her fingers, swollen with arthritis and marked by age spots that told the story of 73 years, trembled slightly as she sorted through the stack of bills that had arrived that morning. Electric company, water department, the pharmacy with its never-ending prescriptions. Each envelope felt heavier than the last. Across from her, Thomas shifted in his chair, the old wood creaking under his weight the way his knees creaked when he stood these days. He didn't look at the bills. He'd learned years ago that watching his wife's face told him everything he needed to know about their financial situation. Right now, the deep lines around her mouth and the way she pressed her lips together spoke volumes. "How bad?" he asked quietly. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She finished writing numbers in the margins of envelopes, adding and subtracting figures that never quite worked in their favor. The apartment was quiet, except for the persistent rattle of that failing radiator and the muffled sounds of their neighbors through walls too thin to provide real privacy. "We can make it through the month," she finally said. Her voice carried the practiced calm of someone who'd been making things stretch for decades. "But we'll need to cut back on the heat during the day. And maybe skip the prescriptions that aren't absolutely critical." Thomas nodded slowly. He knew which prescriptions she meant: his blood pressure medication, her vitamins, the pain pills for his back, the ones that made life more comfortable but weren't strictly necessary for survival. They'd become experts at distinguishing between survival and comfort. The apartment they rented sat in a building constructed sometime in the 1960s, and it hadn't been updated much since. The carpet was a faded brown, worn through to the padding in high-traffic areas. The kitchen appliances were harvest gold, a color that had been fashionable when Richard Nixon was president. The bathroom faucet leaked no matter how many times Thomas tried to fix it, and the bedroom window had a crack sealed with duct tape because replacing it would cost more than a month's rent. But it was theirs. Or at least, they'd lived there long enough that it felt like theirs. 11 years in this same unit, watching the neighborhood slowly decline around them, watching the rent creep up while their fixed income stayed stubbornly fixed. Margaret stood with effort, her knees protesting, and walked to the small kitchen to refill her tea. She'd learned to reuse the same tea bag 3 or 4 times. Not because she enjoyed weak tea, but because every dollar saved on groceries was a dollar that could go toward keeping the lights on or the water running. Thomas watched her move through their cramped space. She'd been beautiful once, and to him she still was, but he could see how the years and worry had carved themselves into her frame. She'd grown thin, not from vanity but from the habit of eating less so he could eat more. Her hair, which she cut herself using a mirror and scissors from the dollar store, had gone completely white. She wore the same 3 outfits in rotation, practical clothes from thrift stores, mended and remended until they were more patch than original fabric. He wasn't in any better shape. His work boots from his postal carrier days, bought 20 years ago, had been resoled twice and would probably need it again soon. His hands, once strong enough to carry a full mailbag for hours, now trembled when he tried to hold a coffee cup. The back injury he'd gotten lifting packages had never properly healed, and now it kept him awake most nights. A constant reminder of the price his body had paid for honest work. They'd done everything right, followed all the rules that were supposed to lead to a comfortable retirement. Thomas had worked for 40 years, barely missing a day, carrying mail through rain and snow and blistering heat. Margaret had spent 35 years as a school librarian, introducing children to books and helping them discover the magic of reading. They'd saved what they could, though it was never much. They'd paid their taxes, attended church, raised their daughter Rachel with love, and what little money remained after the necessities. And somehow, despite doing everything right, they'd ended up here, in a one-bedroom apartment with failing heat, sorting bills they could barely pay, wondering if they'd have enough left over for groceries after the landlord cashed the rent check. Their daughter called every Tuesday evening. Rachel lived in Oregon with her husband Donald and their 3 children. She'd made a good life out there, or at least she had, until Donald's company downsized him out of a job 6 months ago. Now she was working 2 jobs while he looked for work, and their calls always carried the weight of things unsaid. Margaret and Thomas never told her how bad things were. When Rachel asked if they needed help, they'd smile into the phone and say they were managing just fine. Because what kind of parents would they be if they became a burden to their daughter when she was already struggling to feed her own children? The afternoon sun, weak and pale, crept across the carpet. Margaret returned to the table with her reheated tea and sat down again, this time pulling out the grocery list she'd been working on. She'd gotten scientific about it over the years, figuring out the exact number of calories they needed to stay functional, buying the cheapest sources of protein and carbohydrates, stretching everything as far as it would go. "I can pick up some shifts at the convenience store," Thomas offered. Not for the first time. "Tom, you're 73 years old, and you're back. I can still stand. I can run a register." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. His skin was papery and dry, marked with scars from decades of work. "I know you can, but you shouldn't have to. Neither of us should." But should and would were different things, and they both knew it. That evening, after a dinner of rice, canned beans, and the last of the previous week's bread toasted to hide its staleness, Margaret walked to the mailbox in the building's lobby to see if anything else had arrived. The overhead light flickered. It had been doing that for weeks, casting uncertain shadows across the battered mailboxes. She expected the usual collection of advertisements and final notices. What she found was a thick, cream-colored envelope that stood out among the cheap bulk mail, like a diamond in a drawer full of rocks. The return address was embossed: Sullivan and Partners, Attorneys at Law, Denver, Colorado. Margaret's heart did something complicated in her chest. Letters from lawyers were never good news. She almost didn't want to open it, didn't want to discover what new crisis or complication had found them. But she carried it upstairs anyway, her feet heavy on each step. Thomas was dozing in his chair when she returned, his chin on his chest, his breath coming in soft snores. Margaret stood for a moment watching him sleep. He looked older when he slept, more vulnerable. She could see the boy he'd been hiding somewhere in that worn face, the young postal worker who'd asked her to dance at the church social 52 years ago. She sat at the table and opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter typed on heavy paper that probably cost more per sheet than they spent on groceries in a day. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, it is our duty to inform you of the passing of Mr. Vincent Hayes, your second cousin, who resided in Summit Ridge, Colorado. Mr. Hayes passed away on January 3rd of this year, as per the terms of his last will and testament, dated June 18th, 1998. You have been named as the sole beneficiaries of his estate, which includes a cabin property located at 4847 Blackwood Trail, Summit Ridge, Colorado, and all contents therein. The property consists of approximately 12 acres of land and a 2-story cabin built in 1963. Please be advised that the property has not been occupied since approximately 2010, and its current condition is unknown. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss the transfer of ownership and any associated legal matters. We have enclosed the necessary documentation for your review. Our condolences for your loss. Sincerely, Patricia Sullivan, Esquire. Margaret read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated. An inheritance. A cabin. 12 acres in Colorado. She looked at Thomas, still sleeping, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly, she was too old and too tired for hope, but maybe the faintest possibility of hope, the distant echo of what hope might sound like if you still believed in such things. "Tom," she said softly. "Tom, wake up." He startled awake, immediately alert in the way people become when they've spent too many years worrying about emergencies. "What? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. At least, I don't think so. Look at this." She handed him the letter. He fumbled for the reading glasses he kept in his shirt pocket and read slowly, his lips moving with the words. When he finished, he looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Vincent Hayes," he said slowly. That's my father's cousin's boy. I met him maybe twice. At family reunions when I was young. He must have been, 5 years older than me. You remember him?" Thomas nodded slowly, reaching back through decades of memory. "Quiet kid. Or quiet man, I guess. My father said he went to Africa right after the service. Vietnam era. But he somehow ended up in Africa instead. Then after he came back, he just disappeared. Dad tried to stay in touch. But Vincent moved around a lot. And then eventually he just stopped responding to letters. And now he's left us his cabin," Margaret said. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them trying to process this unexpected development. "It's probably worthless," Thomas finally said. "Letter says it hasn't been lived in for over a decade. In mountain country, that means the roof's probably caved in, pipes burst, floor rotted out, probably animals living in it. But the land," Margaret said, 12 acres in Colorado. Even if the cabin's ruined, the land has to be worth something." Thomas picked up the letter again, studying it. "Summit Ridge. I looked that up once, years ago, when I was trying to find Vincent. It's way up in the mountains. Remote. Not much up there except snow and pine trees. Could we sell it? Maybe. Probably. If we can find a buyer." He paused. "There'll be property taxes owed. Maybe back taxes if Vincent wasn't keeping up with payments. Legal fees for the transfer. Could eat up most of whatever we'd get from a sale." Margaret felt that brief flicker of possibility start to dim. Of course there would be complications. There were always complications when you were poor. The universe made sure of that. But then Thomas did something unexpected. He stood up, walked to the bookshelf, where they kept their old road atlas, the one they'd used for the 3 or 4 real vacations they'd taken over the years, and opened it to the Colorado page. "Summit Ridge," he said, tracing the map with his finger. "It's about 2,000 miles from here. 4, maybe 5 days of driving if we took it slow. Margaret looked at him. "Tom, what are you thinking?" He didn't answer immediately. He stood there, staring at the map, at the thin red lines representing highways that led west, away from this small apartment and its failing radiator and its stack of unpayable bills. "I'm thinking," he finally said, "that we could go look at it before we sell it, just to see what Vincent left us, what he wanted us to have. We can't afford the trip. Gas alone would be. We have the credit card. The one we keep for emergencies." "This isn't an emergency, Tom." He turned to face her, and she was startled by the intensity in his eyes. "Isn't it? Maggie, we're barely surviving here. Another few months and we won't be able to afford even this place. We'll be living with Rachel, cramped into her house, trying not to be in the way, while her family struggles to make ends meet. So, you want to spend money we don't have to drive across the country to look at a broken-down cabin?" "I want," Thomas said slowly, "to see what my cousin thought was important enough to leave to us. I want to stand on 12 acres of land that belongs to us, instead of a landlord. I want—" He paused, struggling for words. "I want one more adventure before I'm too old to have adventures. Is that crazy?" Margaret looked at him, really, looked at him, and saw past the 73 years and the failing body to the young man who'd been brave enough to ask her to dance, who'd carried her over the threshold of their first apartment, who'd held her when they lost their second pregnancy, who'd worked until his back broke to give their daughter a better life than they'd had. "It's probably crazy," she said quietly. "But you know what? I think I want to be crazy with you." Thomas smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "Really? Really? We'll probably regret it. The cabin's probably falling apart. We'll probably spend our emergency fund on a wild goose chase and come back worse off than we started. Probably." Thomas agreed. "But at least we'll have tried," Margaret said. "At least we'll have one more story to tell." They spent the rest of the evening planning. Thomas calculated the gas mileage their ancient sedan got and mapped out the cheapest route. Margaret called the lawyer's office and left a message saying they'd be coming to Colorado to see the property in person. They packed light 2 duffel bags with warm clothes because February in the mountains would be brutal. They made sandwiches for the road. They unplugged everything in the apartment to save on the electric bill while they were gone. And through it all, Margaret felt something stirring in her chest that she'd almost forgotten the shape of. Not hope, exactly, but something close to it. The possibility that life might still have surprises left. That there might be more to their story than slowly running out of money and waiting for the end. Their daughter Rachel called that evening, her regular Tuesday call. "How are you both doing?" she asked. The question weighted with worry. "We're good, sweetheart," Margaret said, and was surprised to find it was almost true. "Actually, we're about to take a trip." "A trip?" "Colorado. Your father inherited a cabin from a cousin he barely knew. We're going to go see it." There was a long pause on the line. "Mom, are you sure that's a good idea? It's winter." "You're not. I mean, you're both. We're both old, Rachel. You can say it. We know. Smy. 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 I was going to say you're both not used to mountain driving. Especially in winter. This sounds dangerous." Sensed applied, Margaret looked at Thomas, who was listening from his chair. "You know what's dangerous? Sitting in this apartment waiting for our money to run out, waiting for our bodies to fail completely, waiting to become a burden to you." "You're not a burden." "Not yet," Margaret interrupted gently. "But we will be, eventually. And before that happens, while we still can, we want to have one more adventure. We want to see what Vincent left us. We want to stand on land that belongs to us, even if it's just for a day before we sell it." Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay, but please be careful. Call me every night so I know you're okay. And Mom, I love you. Both of you. We love you too, sweetheart. Don't worry about us. We've survived this long. We can handle a road trip." After they hung up, Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. She wasn't sure when she'd started crying. "Second thoughts?" Thomas asked. She shook her head. "No. Just thinking about how lucky we are to have her, and how much I don't want to burden her with our problems." "Then we'll figure something out," Thomas said firmly. "Even if the cabin's worthless, even if we come back with nothing, at least we tried. At least we took a chance." They left before dawn on a Monday morning. The sky was still dark, stars fading as the first hint of light touched the eastern horizon. Their car, a 20-year-old sedan with rust spots and a tendency to pull to the left, sat in the parking lot, covered in frost. Thomas scraped the windshield, while Margaret loaded their meager supplies. The cooler with sandwiches, the thermos of coffee, their duffel bags, a toolbox, because Thomas couldn't help thinking they might need tools, a first aid kit, the atlas. All of it fit easily in the small trunk. As Thomas backed out of the parking space they'd occupied for 11 years, Margaret took one last look at the apartment building. 4 stories of faded brick and chipped paint. Home, such as it was. "No regrets?" Thomas asked. "Only that we didn't do this sooner," Margaret replied. The drive out of the city was quiet. Traffic was light at this hour, just a few early commuters and delivery trucks. They merged onto the interstate as the sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. For the first 100 miles, neither of them spoke much. They were both lost in their own thoughts, processing the magnitude of what they were doing. They'd left their apartment, their routine, their careful management of every penny, to drive 2,000 miles, based on a letter from a lawyer about a cousin they barely remembered. It was reckless. It was irresponsible. It was possibly the stupidest thing they'd done in decades. It was also the most alive Margaret had felt in years. They stopped for gas at a truck stop somewhere in Kansas. While Thomas filled the tank, watching the numbers climb with each gallon, mentally calculating how much this was costing them, Margaret went inside to use the bathroom and stretch her legs. The convenience store smelled like burnt coffee and fried food. Behind the counter, a young woman, probably not even 25, looked exhausted despite the early hour. Margaret bought 2 cups of coffee and a bag of peanuts, the cheapest calories she could find. "Road trip?" the girl asked, as she rang up the purchase. "Something like that," Margaret said. "Must be nice. I haven't left this town in 3 years." Margaret looked at the girl's name tag Ashley and saw exhaustion and resignation in her young eyes. She recognized that look. She'd worn it herself for decades. "It's never too late to leave," Margaret said gently. "If you want to." Ashley smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Sure. Maybe someday." Back in the car, Margaret was quiet as they pulled back onto the highway. "What's wrong?" Thomas asked. "Nothing. Just thinking about that girl in there. How tired she looked. How trapped." "We were trapped too," Thomas said. "Maybe we still are. Maybe this trip doesn't change anything." "Maybe," Margaret agreed. "But at least we're moving. At least we're trying." They drove through the day, stopping frequently for bathroom breaks and to let Thomas stretch his aching back. The landscape changed gradually as they moved west, flat farmland giving way to rolling prairies, then to the first hints of mountains on the horizon. That night they slept in a budget motel off the highway. The room smelled like cigarettes and industrial cleaner, and the mattress sagged in the middle, but it was clean enough. They ate convenience store sandwiches for dinner and watched the weather report on the ancient television bolted to the dresser. Storm systems moving through the Rockies, the weatherman said cheerfully. Heavy snow expected at elevations above 8,000 feet. Thomas and Margaret looked at each other. How high up is Summit Ridge? Margaret asked. Thomas pulled out the packet of information the lawyer had sent. Property is at 9,200 feet elevation. So we're driving into a snowstorm. Looks that way. They lay in bed that night listening to trucks rumble past on the highway, the sound filtering through thin walls. We could turn back, Margaret said into the darkness. No one would blame us. Would you blame us? Thomas asked. Margaret thought about it. About the apartment waiting for them. About the bills and the struggling and the slow erosion of everything they'd worked for. About being 73 years old and realizing that if they didn't take this chance now, there might never be another one. Yes, she said finally. I think I would. The next morning they crossed into Colorado. The mountains rose up ahead of them like teeth, snow-capped and imposing. The temperature dropped steadily as they climbed in elevation, and their car's heater, which had never been great, struggled to keep up. They stopped in a town called Fairplay to buy emergency supplies, a real snow shovel, flashlights with extra batteries, emergency blankets, bottled water, instant coffee, energy bars. It ate up more of their credit card limit. But Thomas insisted. If we get stuck up there, he said, we need to be able to survive. The woman at the sporting goods store looked at them skeptically. You folks headed up into the high country? Summit Ridge, Thomas said. Her eyebrows rose. That's pretty remote. Road up there gets dicey in winter. You got four-wheel drive? Thomas glanced at their aging sedan through the window. We'll manage, the woman shrugged. It's your funeral. But seriously, if you get into trouble, cell service up there is non-existent. Make sure someone knows where you're going. After they left, Margaret called Rachel and left a detailed message about their route and destination, just in case. They reached Summit Ridge just as the afternoon sun started its descent. The town, if you could call it that, consisted of maybe 10 buildings clustered around one intersection. A gas station that looked like it might have been built in the 70s, a general store with a faded awning, a diner with a neon sign that flickered uncertainly, a post office the size of a garden shed. They pulled into the gas station, and Thomas killed the engine. They both sat for a moment, staring at the mountains rising around them like walls, at the snow that covered everything, at the sheer remoteness of this place. Last chance to turn back, Margaret said. Thomas looked at her and smiled. Not a chance. They filled the tank and went into the general store. An older woman with weathered skin and sharp eyes sat behind the counter reading a paperback western. Help you folks? She asked, marking her place and setting the book down. We're looking for Blackwood Trail, Thomas said. Property up there that we just inherited. The woman's expression shifted, not quite suspicion, but close. The Hayes place. You knew Vincent? Margaret asked. Everyone knew Vincent. Hard not to know someone when there's only about 200 people living in a 20-mile radius. He came down here maybe twice a year for supplies. Quiet man. Kept to himself. She paused. That road hasn't been plowed in months. You planning on going up there today? That's the plan, Thomas said. The woman shook her head slowly. It's almost dark. Temperatures dropping. Even if you make it up there, you won't be able to get back down tonight. Could be days before anyone finds you if something goes wrong. We have supplies, Thomas said. We'll be okay. They bought more supplies anyway, matches, candles, propane canisters for a camp stove, rope, more batteries. The woman rang everything up with the air of someone who'd seen plenty of foolish people do foolish things in the mountains. Your funeral, she said, echoing the woman from the sporting goods store. Blackwood Trail is about 8 miles up the main road, then another 7 miles on a Forest Service road. You'll see a marker, probably buried under snow. House is maybe another half-mile past that. Good luck. As they loaded the supplies into the car, Margaret felt her heart pounding. This was it. They were really doing this. The road up was exactly as treacherous as promised. What showed as a proper road on the map was really just 2 tire tracks through snow that in places came up past their bumper. Thomas drove in first gear, the engine whining in protest, the car sliding and catching with every turn. Branches scraped the sides of the vehicle. Once, they had to stop and dig out when the car got high-centered on a snowdrift. Full darkness fell before they found the marker. Thomas almost missed it. A weathered wooden post with the words "Private Road," barely visible under accumulated snow. He turned onto what he hoped was the Forest Service road, though it was impossible to tell where the road ended and the surrounding forest began. There, Margaret said suddenly, pointing ahead. Through the trees, barely visible in the headlights, was a structure. As they got closer, the shape resolved into a cabin larger than Margaret had expected. 2 stories of logs and stone with a steep roof designed to shed snow. But snow had accumulated anyway, piling up on the roof, against the walls, drifting across what must be a porch, until only the top of the door was visible. Thomas stopped the car about 50 yards away. He couldn't get any closer without risking getting stuck. They sat for a moment, engine running, heater blowing weakly, both of them staring at what they'd inherited. Well, Thomas finally said, we came all this way. Might as well see what we've got. We came 17 groovy. They climbed out into the bitter cold. The temperature had to be in the single digits, and the wind cut through their coats like they weren't even there. Margaret's breath came out in clouds, and her fingers immediately started going numb despite her gloves. The snow was deep well above their knees. They had to high-step through it, using the shovel to break a path. It was exhausting work. Every few feet, they had to stop and catch their breath, their hearts pounding, their lungs burning from the thin mountain air. By the time they reached the buried porch, both of them were sweating despite the cold. Thomas began shoveling in earnest, clearing the drifts away from the door. Margaret helped as much as she could, using her gloved hands to push snow aside. The cabin door, when they finally uncovered it, was solid wood, swollen and stuck in its frame. Thomas fitted the key the lawyer had sent into the lock. It turned smoothly, too smoothly for a place supposedly abandoned for over a decade. He put his shoulder against the door and pushed. Nothing. He tried again, grunting with effort. On the 3rd try, the door suddenly gave way, swinging inward with a shriek of protest. A smell rolled out: old wood, dust, and something else. Something that suggested secrets kept too long. Thomas stepped inside first, Margaret right behind him. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing a large main room with a massive stone fireplace, furniture under sheets, a kitchen with old-fashioned appliances. It was cold inside, nearly as cold as outside, but the structure seemed sound. The roof hadn't collapsed. The windows were intact. This wasn't the ruin they'd expected. "Tom," Margaret whispered. "This place." "I know," he said quietly. They worked quickly despite their exhaustion, bringing in their supplies, clearing a space near the fireplace. Thomas found wood stacked neatly beside the hearth, dry wood, preserved, as if Vincent had simply walked out one day planning to return. It took several tries, but Thomas finally got a fire started. The flames pushed back the darkness and began to warm the frigid air. They sat on their sleeping bags near the fire, eating peanut butter sandwiches they'd made 3 days ago, and looked around at the cabin that now belonged to them. "What do you think it's worth?" Margaret asked. Thomas shook his head. "I don't know. The structure's solid. That's worth something. The land 12 acres, this remote, hard to say. Maybe 50,000, maybe more." Margaret did the math in her head. $50,000. After taxes and legal fees, maybe they'd clear 35 or 40. Enough to buy them a few more years. Maybe rent a slightly better apartment. Maybe cover Rachel's mortgage for a year. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was something. "We should probably head back tomorrow," she said. "Get this listed with a real estate agent. Try to sell it before spring. Probably." Thomas agreed. Neither of them moved. They just sat there, warm for the first time in days, looking at the cabin that had somehow survived years of abandonment, feeling like they'd accomplished something just by making it here. "Tom," Margaret said after a while. "Yeah, thank you. For suggesting this trip. For being crazy with me." He reached over and took her hand. "Best decision I ever made. Well, second best. First was asking you to dance 52 years ago." Margaret smiled and squeezed his fingers. "We should get some sleep. Long drive back tomorrow." But as she lay down in her sleeping bag, watching the firelight dance on the log walls, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place was different. That Vincent hadn't just left them a cabin and some land. That there was more to this inheritance than met the eye. She fell asleep with that thought drifting through her mind, while outside the snow continued to fall, burying them deeper in this remote corner of the world, in this unexpected twist in the story of their lives. Tomorrow everything would change. But tonight, for the first time in years, Margaret and Thomas Hayes slept peacefully, warm and safe in the cabin their forgotten cousin had left them, not knowing that the real discovery, the one that would transform their lives forever, waited just behind the stone fireplace, sealed away in darkness, patient as only diamonds can be. Morning came slowly to the mountains, dawn creeping through the cabin windows, like it wasn't quite sure it was welcome. Margaret woke first, her back aching from sleeping on the floor despite the padding of the sleeping bag. The fire had burned down to embers, and her breath misted in the cold air. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The drive, the snow, the inheritance. She sat up carefully, wincing as her joints protested. Beside her, Thomas still slept, his snoring soft and steady. In the pale morning light, she could see the cabin more clearly than she had the night before. It was bigger than she'd realized, the main room spacious, with the massive stone fireplace dominating one wall. The kitchen area off to the left looked functional, if outdated. A staircase led up to what must be a second floor. Margaret added wood to the fire and waited for the flames to catch before she stood and began exploring. Every surface was thick with dust, but beneath that dust was something unexpected care. The books on the shelves were arranged neatly, their spines faded but orderly. The furniture under the sheets was solid and well maintained. Tools hung on pegboards near the back door with a precision that suggested someone who valued order. This wasn't a place someone had abandoned. This was a place someone had been forced to leave. She found the kitchen surprisingly well stocked with canned goods, though the dates showed they'd expired years ago. Plates sat in cupboards, clean despite the dust. Silverware lay organized in drawers. In a pantry, jars of preserves lined the shelves. Peaches, tomatoes, green beans, all dated from 2009. Maggie? She turned to find Thomas sitting up, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Morning," she said. "I was just looking around. Tom, this place, it's not what we expected." He stood with a groan and joined her, moving through the space with the same sense of wonder she felt. They climbed the stairs together, their footsteps creaking on the wooden treads. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms, both furnished simply but completely. One had a bed with a hand-sewn quilt. The other was set up as an office, with a desk, filing cabinets, and more books. In the closet of the main bedroom, Vincent's clothes still hung on wooden hangers: flannel shirts, heavy coats, sturdy pants, boots lined up below, polished and maintained. Margaret ran her fingers along the sleeve of a coat, feeling the weight of the fabric. "He lived here alone for 40 years, she said quietly. "All by himself in these mountains." "Why?" Thomas asked. "That's what I can't figure out. He had family, distant family maybe, but still, why hide up here?" Margaret shook her head. She didn't have an answer. They spent the morning doing a thorough inventory. The cabin was remarkably sound. The roof didn't leak. The windows were intact. The log walls solid. The plumbing was old, but appeared functional, though everything was currently frozen. Same with the electricity, there was wiring, but the power had been shut off years ago. "With some work," Thomas said, running his hand along a window frame, "this place could actually be livable again. Good bones. Someone built this to last." They found a generator in a shed out back, protected from the weather. Thomas spent an hour getting it running, and when it finally coughed to life, they both cheered. With power restored, they could at least heat water and charge their phones. Though, as the woman at the store had warned, there was no cell signal this high up. Over lunch, energy bars and instant coffee heated over the camp stove, they discussed next steps. "We should probably spend a few days here," Thomas said. "Make sure we understand what we have before we try to sell it. Check for any structural issues, water damage, foundation problems. The more we know, the better price we can ask." Margaret nodded, but her attention kept drifting to the fireplace. All morning, as they'd explored and cleaned, she'd found herself standing in front of it, studying it, trying to understand what bothered her about it. The stonework was beautiful river rock and granite fitted together with obvious skill and care. But something about it felt off. Not wrong. Exactly. Just different. Like a word you know you've misspelled but can't quite figure out how. "Tom," she finally said, "come look at this." He joined her in front of the fireplace, following her gaze. "What am I looking at?" Margaret pointed to the left side, about 4 feet up from the hearth. "Does that section look different to you? The stones, the way they're fitted together." Thomas leaned closer. The stones in that area did seem slightly different. The mortar appeared newer, the fit less seamless than the rest of the fireplace. He ran his hand along the surface, feeling the texture. "Could be a repair," he said. "Maybe part of it got damaged and had to be rebuilt." "Maybe," Margaret said, but she didn't sound convinced. Thomas knocked gently on the stones with his knuckles. The sound that came back was hollow, distinctly different from the solid thud of the surrounding masonry. They looked at each other. "That doesn't sound right," Margaret said. Thomas knocked again, moving his hand across the surface. Most of the fireplace sounded solid, dense, but this section, roughly 3 feet by 4 feet, echoed slightly when struck. Could be a storage nook, he said, trying to think of a logical explanation. Some old cabins had them built into the chimney to keep things from freezing, root vegetables, preserves, that kind of thing. Or, Margaret said slowly, it could be something else. Thomas found his toolbox in the car and returned with a hammer, chisel, and pry bar. He studied the suspicious section for a long moment before beginning to carefully chip away at the mortar around one of the stones. Margaret held the flashlight, her hands trembling slightly. She told herself it was just the cold, but that wasn't entirely true. Something about this felt significant, though she couldn't have explained why. The mortar came away easier than it should have, much easier. Like it had been mixed to be removable rather than permanent. Thomas worked carefully, not wanting to damage anything, gradually loosening the stones in that section. After about 30 minutes, he was able to grip the edge of a large cornerstone and pull. It resisted at first, then suddenly came free, revealing darkness behind it. Cold air rushed out, stale and undisturbed, carrying a smell like old storage and secrets. Thomas removed another stone, then another, until there was a gap large enough to shine the flashlight through. Margaret aimed the beam into the opening. They both gasped. Behind the false wall was a room small, maybe 6 feet square, carved directly into the stone of the mountain itself. And filling that room, stacked in wooden crates, metal boxes, and cloth bags, were stones. Thousands upon thousands of them. They caught the flashlight beam and threw it back in a million fractures of light, like someone had trapped stars and locked them away in darkness. Diamonds. Margaret's flashlight slipped in her suddenly nerveless fingers. She caught it before it fell, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. That's not. Thomas started, then stopped. Those can't be. But even as he said it, they both knew what they were seeing. The way the stones caught and bent the light, the sheer quantity of them, the careful way they'd been stored and hidden. These were diamonds. Real diamonds. More diamonds than either of them had ever seen outside of a jewelry store display case. Thomas stumbled backward, nearly falling. Margaret caught his arm, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from that opening, from that impossible, glittering wealth sealed away in darkness. "Oh my God," Thomas whispered. "Oh my God, Maggie, what is this?" Margaret's mind raced, trying to process what she was seeing, trying to calculate what it meant. But the numbers were too big, the implications too vast. Her knees felt weak, and she realized she was holding her breath. "We need to open it more," she heard herself say. Her voice sounded strange, distant, like it was coming from someone else. "We need to see how much is really there." They worked like people possessed, all fatigue forgotten, carefully removing the false wall stone by stone. The opening grew larger, 2 feet wide, then 3, then 4. Finally, it was big enough to crawl through. Thomas went first, moving slowly on his hands and knees, flashlight clenched between his teeth. Margaret followed, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The hidden room was cold as a grave and just as still. The wooden crates were old military surplus, stenciled with faded numbers and markings. The metal boxes were locked with simple padlocks that looked more decorative than secure. The cloth bags were tied with twine, their fabric dusty but intact. Thomas picked up one of the bags with trembling hands and loosened the drawstring. He poured a handful of diamonds into his palm, rough stones, uncut, but unmistakably real. They made a soft clicking sound as they rolled across his weathered skin, catching even the weak flashlight beam with an inner fire. Margaret opened one of the metal boxes. The padlock broke easily under pressure from the pry bar. Inside, diamonds already cut and polished were sorted by size into divided compartments, stones ranging from tiny chips to pieces the size of her thumbnail. She picked one up, unable to quite believe what she was holding. It was heavy, substantial, and caught the light with a brilliance that seemed almost alive. "This isn't possible," Thomas said. His voice sounded hollow, distant. "This can't be real. This doesn't happen to people like us." But it was real. Margaret could feel the weight of the stone in her hand, could see the way the light bent and shattered through its facets. She reached into another crate and found leather-bound ledgers, their pages filled with cramped handwriting and columns of numbers. She opened one and started reading by flashlight. Her hands shook so badly. The pages rustled. "Tom," she said after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. "These are records, dates, weights, descriptions, origins. This one goes back to 1968. Thomas picked up another ledger, flipping through pages of meticulous documentation. Each entry listed a date, a description of stones, weights in carats, locations, sources. The handwriting was precise, obsessive. The work of someone who'd spent decades cataloging every single stone. "Where did he get all these?" Thomas asked. "You can't just buy this many diamonds. This has to be." He couldn't finish the sentence. Neither of them wanted to say what they were both thinking. Stolen. They spent the next hour going through the hidden room, their initial shock giving way to systematic examination. There were more documents, receipts, certificates of authenticity, letters. Margaret found a locked briefcase and used a rock to break the corroded lock. Inside were more papers, photographs yellowed with age, and a thick folder marked "Private" in faded ink. She pulled it out and sat against the cold stone wall, reading by flashlight, while Thomas continued inventorying the diamonds. What she discovered made her stomach turn. The documents told a story. Vincent Hayes had worked for a diamond company in Africa in the late 1960s. There were letters, memos, photographs of him in work clothes standing beside mining equipment. According to the papers, there had been a civil war, chaos, a mine that changed hands multiple times between government forces and rebels. Vincent had been caught in the middle of it. The letters suggested he'd helped people, refugees fleeing the violence. He'd hidden them, transported them, gotten them to safety at considerable personal risk. And somehow, in the process, he'd ended up with diamonds. Lots and lots of diamonds. One letter, dated June 14, 1971, was from someone named Samuel. It was addressed to Vincent and appeared to be a response to a letter Vincent had written. "Dear Vincent, I received your letter with much concern. I understand your worry about the stones. But please, my friend, you must understand you saved my family, my wife, my 3 children, my elderly mother. We would all be dead without your courage. Those diamonds were payment for our lives, freely given in gratitude and respect. No one is looking for them. The company collapsed. The records were destroyed in the fighting. The men who ran that operation are dead or scattered. What you have is yours, earned through blood and mercy. You put your own life at risk for people you did not know, for no reason except that it was right. Build a life with these stones. Buy land, start a business, find peace. You have earned that much and more. Do not let guilt poison this gift. We gave them freely. with grateful hearts. Your friend always, Samuel. Margaret passed the letter to Thomas with trembling hands. He read it twice, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding, to something like relief. So he didn't steal them, Thomas said slowly. They were given to him, payment for saving lives, or a gift, or both. Margaret looked around the hidden room at the fortune stacked in boxes and bags, but he never used them, never sold a single one, as far as I can tell from these records. He just kept them, hid them away up here, and lived on almost nothing. But why? Thomas asked. Why hide a fortune when you could use it to actually live? Margaret found another letter, this one in Vincent's own handwriting, apparently a draft that was never sent. The paper was creased and stained, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. I cannot touch them. I know what Samuel said. I know they were freely given, but every time I look at these stones, I see the faces of the people I could not save, the children who died before we could get them to safety, the families torn apart, the villages burned. Yes, I saved Samuel's family. I am grateful for that. But I failed so many others. These diamonds, they feel like blood money, even though I know that is not fair to Samuel and the others who gave them to me. They meant it as a blessing, but I can only see the curse. I brought them here meaning to sell them, to start over, to build something new. But I cannot. So I will keep them safe. Maybe someday they will mean something different to someone else. Maybe someday they will represent hope instead of horror. Maybe someday someone braver than I am will know what to do with them. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. She hadn't realized she was crying. She handed the letter to Thomas, who read it with his jaw clenched tight. They sat in that cold, hidden room for a long time, surrounded by more wealth than they'd ever imagined, beginning to understand the burden that came with it. What do we do? Margaret finally asked. Thomas looked at her, his face drawn and tired in the flashlight's glow. I don't know. I honestly don't know. They crawled back out of the hidden room and sat by the fire, neither speaking for a long time. The diamonds were still there, waiting in the darkness behind them. The fortune was real. The complications were real. And they had no idea what to do next. Margaret put another log on the fire and watched the flames climb. She thought about Vincent Hayes, about the weight he'd carried for 5 decades, about the choice he'd made to hide the diamonds rather than use them, to let them sit in darkness rather than risk doing something wrong with them. He left them to us, she said quietly. The cabin, the diamonds, all of it. He could have destroyed them, could have thrown them in a lake, or buried them where no one would ever find them, but he left them to family. Thomas nodded slowly. Maybe he hoped we'd be braver than he was, or wiser, or at least different. Or maybe, Margaret said, he just hoped we'd understand. The fire popped and cracked. Outside, the mountains stood silent, indifferent to the struggle happening within the cabin walls. They tried to sleep that night, but it was impossible. Margaret lay in her sleeping bag staring at the ceiling beams, her mind spinning with impossible calculations. Thomas tossed beside her, sighing heavily. Every few minutes, around 2 a.m, Margaret heard him get up. He added wood to the fire and sat in one of Vincent's chairs, staring into the flames. Can't sleep? She asked softly. Keep thinking about the numbers, Thomas said. Even if we only sold a fraction of what's in there, we'd have enough money to live comfortably for the rest of our lives. More than enough. We could pay off Rachel's house, send the grandkids to college. We could. He trailed off. 119:7. 119:17. We could also go to prison, Margaret said gently. Tom, we don't know if those diamonds are legal to possess. We don't know if there are rightful owners somewhere still looking for them. We don't understand the laws around this international trade. Precious stones, estate transfers. This is so far beyond anything we've ever dealt with. Thomas nodded, his face haggard in the firelight. I know. I keep thinking about that too. What if we report it, and the government just takes it all? What if they decide Vincent obtained them illegally, and we're accomplices? What if we end up worse off than when we started? Margaret finished. They sat in silence for a while. But we can't just keep quiet about this, Thomas finally said. Can we? I mean, that's basically theft, or concealment, or something illegal. Margaret sat up, pulling the sleeping bag around her shoulders. I don't know. This is too big, Tom. This is so far beyond our experience. We're 73 years old. We worked honest jobs our whole lives. We've never dealt with anything like this. So what do we do? Thomas asked. First thing tomorrow. I mean, what's our actual next step? Margaret thought about it. About the letters they'd found. About Samuel's words. About Vincent's guilt. About the fact that those diamonds had been freely given by people who were grateful their lives had been saved. About the decades Vincent had spent paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. First thing tomorrow, she said slowly, we document everything. We photograph every stone, every paper, every letter. We copy the ledgers. We make a complete inventory. Then we figure out who we need to talk to lawyers. Maybe the authorities. Someone who understands international law and precious stones. You mean turn ourselves in? Thomas asked. I mean get help, Margaret said. We're in over our heads. We need people who know about these things to tell us what's legal, what's not, what our options are. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, what if I just wanted to take a few? Not all of them. Not even most. Just enough to pay our bills for a few years. No one would ever know. Margaret looked at him, at her husband of 51 years, at the exhaustion and fear in his face. She understood the temptation. God knows she'd been thinking the same thing. Vincent would know, she said softly. And we'd know, and it would eat at us the same way it ate at him. Every time we spent that money, we'd wonder if we'd stolen it. If we'd done the wrong thing. If we'd betrayed the people who gave those stones to Vincent in gratitude. Thomas rubbed his face with both hands. So, we'd just give it all up? Watch it get taken away by the government or lawyers or whoever? I don't know, Margaret admitted. Maybe. But at least we'd be able to sleep at night. They returned to their sleeping bags. But sleep still wouldn't come. Margaret stared at the fire shadows dancing on the log walls and tried to imagine different futures. In one, they kept the diamonds secret and lived in fear of discovery. In another, they reported everything and watched their unexpected fortune disappear into legal complications. In a third, they tried to do something good with the money. Something that would honor Vincent's guilt and Samuel's gratitude both. But every scenario seemed fraught with danger, with moral complications, with the possibility of making everything worse. Dawn came eventually, grey and cold. Margaret had maybe slept an hour, her dreams fractured and anxious. Thomas looked even worse, his eyes red-rimmed, his face pale. They made instant coffee and ate energy bars for breakfast, neither of them speaking much. The cabin felt different now. The comfortable sanctuary of the night before had been replaced by something heavier, more oppressive. The hidden room behind the fireplace, pressed on them like a physical weight. After breakfast, Thomas got out his phone and started taking photographs. He documented the false wall, the hidden entrance, every angle of the room beyond. He photographed the crates, the boxes, the bags. He opened containers and photographed the diamonds themselves. Rough stones, cut stones, large and small. Margaret copied the ledgers by hand, writing down dates and descriptions and numbers that made her hand cramp just from writing them. So many stones, so much wealth, so much responsibility. By afternoon, they had hundreds of photos and dozens of pages of notes. Thomas backed everything up to a small flash drive he'd brought for documents. "Now what?" he asked. Margaret looked at the opening in the fireplace, at the darkness beyond, where $234 million in diamonds waited for a decision that two elderly people, in way over their heads, had to somehow make. "Now," she said, "we figure out who we can trust to help us, because we can't do this alone." That night was even worse than the one before. Every creak of the cabin made Margaret's heart race, certain that someone had found out about the diamonds, that they were about to be robbed or arrested or worse. Every gust of wind sounded like vehicles approaching. Every shadow looked like a person watching from the darkness. Thomas paced the cabin, unable to sit still, wearing a path in the dusty floor between the fireplace and the kitchen. "We're not criminals," he muttered at one point. "We inherited this place. We found something hidden here. That doesn't make us criminals." "Doesn't it?" Margaret asked. She was sitting at Vincent's old desk, still going through papers. "If we know about a fortune and don't report it, isn't that a crime? Concealment or something?" But it was freely given to Vincent. The letters prove that. Letters 50 years old from people who might be dead. From a country that doesn't exist anymore. "Tom, we have no way to verify any of this. For all we know, Vincent was lying to himself. For all we know, he did steal these." Thomas stopped pacing and looked at her. "You don't believe that?" Margaret sighed. "No, I don't. The guilt in his letters that was real. Vincent was tormented by this. But what I believe, and what we can prove, are different things." She found another document, a hand-drawn map with notations in Vincent's handwriting. It showed the cabin, the mountains, and several locations marked with X's and notes. Cache point 1, cache point 2. Backup storage. "Tom," she said slowly, "I think there might be more." She said it. He came to look at the map. "More what?" "More diamonds. Look at these markings. I think Vincent hid diamonds in multiple locations, not just in the cabin." Thomas sat down heavily. "Oh God! How much more?" Margaret studied the map. The notations suggested at least 3 other hiding places, though it was hard to tell from the crude drawing exactly where they might be. "We can't search for them now," Thomas said. "Not in winter. Not with snow this deep. I'm not sure we should search for them at all," Margaret said. "We're already drowning. More just makes it worse." They sat together in the flickering firelight, both of them feeling the weight of Vincent's secret crushing down on them. They'd come here expecting to find a broken-down cabin they could sell for enough money to buy them a few more years of scraping by. Instead, they'd found a fortune and a burden and a choice that seemed impossible to make. "Tomorrow," Thomas finally said. "Tomorrow we drive back to town. We find the lawyer who sent us the inheritance papers. We tell her everything. We ask for help." Margaret nodded. It was the only plan that made sense. They couldn't handle this alone. They needed someone who understood law and diamonds and international complications. They needed someone to tell them if they were sitting on a legitimate inheritance or holding evidence of a 50-year-old crime. They needed someone to help them decide if Vincent's gift was a blessing or a curse. That night, Margaret dreamed of diamonds pouring from her hands like water, each stone carrying a face, people she'd never met but somehow knew were the ones Vincent couldn't save. In her dream, Samuel was there too, holding out his hands, asking her to do what Vincent couldn't, to transform guilt into grace, burden into blessing. She woke with tears on her face and Thomas's hand gripping hers in the darkness. "I heard you crying," he whispered. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Tom, I'm so scared. We're too old for this. We don't know what we're doing." "I know," he said. "But we'll figure it out. We always have." Margaret wanted to believe him. But as she lay there, listening to the wind howl through the mountains and the cabins settle around them, all she could think about was Vincent Hayes, spending 40 years alone in these mountains, paralyzed by a gift he couldn't bring himself to use. She didn't want that to be their story too. The diamonds waited in the darkness behind the fireplace, patient as only diamonds can be. They'd waited 50 years already. They could wait a little longer. But Margaret and Thomas couldn't wait. They were 73 years old, and time was not their friend. Whatever they decided to do about Vincent's secret, about the fortune hidden in the mountains, about the choice between legal safety and financial security, they had to decide soon. Because sometimes the weight of wealth is heavier than the weight of poverty. And sometimes the hardest question isn't how to survive when you have nothing. It's what to do when you suddenly have everything, and no idea if it's really yours to keep. The drive back down the mountain the next morning was treacherous. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, and Thomas had to navigate carefully, the car sliding on switchbacks, while Margaret gripped the door handle and prayed silently. Neither of them spoke much. The weight of what they'd discovered sat between them like a third passenger. When they finally reached Summit Ridge, Thomas pulled into the parking lot of the general store. They needed supplies, but more than that, they needed information. The same weathered woman from before sat behind the counter, her paperback, Western, open to a new page. "You folks made it back down," she said, looking up. "Wasn't sure you would, weather being what it is." "We made it," Margaret said, "though just barely." "Can I ask you something?" The woman marked her page. "Shoot, you said you knew Vincent Hayes. What was he like?" "What was he like?" The woman studied them for a long moment, as if deciding how much to share. "Quiet, kept to himself, but decent, you know? Couple times when folks were in trouble up here, bad winters, medical emergencies, that sort of thing, Vincent would show up with supplies or offer to help. Never wanted thanks. Never wanted payment. Just did what needed doing. And disappeared back up to that cabin." "Did he ever talk about his past?" Thomas asked. "About Africa? Or the war?" The woman's expression shifted. "So, you found something up there?" It wasn't a question. Margaret's heart skipped. "What makes you say that?" "Because that's the only reason anyone asks about Vincent's past. He told me once, years ago when he'd had too much whiskey on a Christmas Eve, that someday someone would come asking questions. Said, when that happened, I should send them to Howard Bentley over on Pike Street. Said Howard knew the whole story." Thomas and Margaret exchanged glances. "Where's Pike Street?" Thomas asked. 20 minutes later, they were standing on the porch of a small cabin on the outskirts of town. The man who answered the door was in his late 60s, lean and weathered, with sharp eyes that took in their faces, their old car, their anxious expressions. "You're the ones who inherited Vincent's place," he said. It wasn't a question. How did you know? Margaret asked. Small town. Word travels. Besides, I've been expecting someone to show up ever since Vincent passed. He stepped back from the door. Come in. We need to talk. Howard Bentley's cabin was warm and cluttered with books, maps, and photographs. He poured them coffee, real coffee, not instant, and settled into an armchair that had clearly been his spot for years. You found the diamonds, he said. Thomas nearly dropped his cup. How do you? Because Vincent told me they were there. I was the only person who knew. Well, me and now you too. Howard sipped his coffee. I've been carrying that secret for 35 years. Honestly, it's a relief to finally tell someone else. Margaret set her cup down carefully. We need to understand what we've found, where those diamonds came from. If they're even legal for us to possess. Howard nodded slowly. That's a complicated question with a complicated answer. Let me start at the beginning. He stood and pulled a photo album from a shelf. Summer of 1968. Vincent and I were both assigned to provide security for a diamond company operating in what was then Rhodesia. The company was corrupt, everyone knew it. They were paying off government officials, exploiting local workers, selling diamonds on the black market, to fund weapons for all sides of the Civil War. He opened the album to show a photograph of two young men in military-style clothing standing beside a jeep. One was clearly Howard. The other must have been Vincent younger, before the weight of secrets had carved itself into his features. We were just there to do a job, Howard continued. Keep the facilities secure, protect the executives. But Vincent, he couldn't ignore what was happening. The workers were treated like slaves, families living in poverty, while the company extracted millions in diamonds from land that belonged to them. Howard turned the page to show more photographs. Mining operations, workers, villages in the distance. When the Civil War intensified, the company's plan was to evacuate the white executives and leave everyone else behind. Vincent wouldn't accept that. He spent weeks secretly organizing an escape route, got food, vehicles, fuel. When the fighting reached the mine, Vincent led about 300 people, workers and their families, through the bush to safer territory, saved their lives. Margaret felt her throat tighten. The letters we found mentioned someone named Samuel. Samuel Madluli, Howard said. He was the foreman at the mine. Good man. His family was among those Vincent saved. He flipped to another photograph showing a group of people, clearly African, standing with Vincent. In the center was a man with a dignified bearing despite his work clothes. That's Samuel. He gave Vincent the diamonds, Thomas said. Howard nodded. The village elders had been skimming stones for years, small ones mostly, insurance against the company's exploitation. When Vincent saved them, they insisted he take what they'd collected. It was all they had to give. In their culture, such a gift was sacred, a life debt repaid with the most precious thing they possessed. How many diamonds are we talking about? Margaret asked. Though she already knew the answer would be staggering. Howard pulled out a worn notebook. Vincent kept detailed records. He showed me everything before he sealed up that room. At last count, approximately 18,000 individual stones. Various sizes, from tiny chips to pieces worth tens of thousands each. He had them appraised in the early 90s by someone who owed him a favor and wouldn't ask questions. The estimate then was around $85 million. With appreciation over the years, could be 3 times that now. The number hit Margaret like a physical blow. $250 million. Maybe more. But he never sold any? Thomas asked. Not a single one, Howard confirmed. I tried to convince him, told him Samuel and the others had given them freely, that he'd earned them by risking his life. But Vincent, he was haunted by the people he couldn't save. There were others, you see, other families who didn't make it, children who died before they could reach safety. Vincent blamed himself for every life lost, even though he'd done more than anyone else would have. Howard's voice grew heavy. He brought the diamonds back to the States thinking he'd use them to start over. But every time he tried to sell even one stone, he'd remember the faces of the dead. So he built that cabin in the most remote place he could find and hid them away. Spent 40 years alone with his guilt. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes. That's so sad. Ah, it's worse than sad, Howard said. It's a tragedy. All that wealth, all that potential to do good, locked away because a good man couldn't forgive himself for not being perfect. He looked at them intently. That's why I'm glad you found them. Vincent told me years ago that if anything happened to him, the cabin and everything in it would go to family. He hoped someone else might be brave enough to use them the way he couldn't. But is it legal? Thomas asked. Can we actually claim them? Howard pulled out a thick folder. Vincent prepared for this. When he sealed up that room in '98, he also gathered every piece of documentation he could find. Letters from Samuel and the other village elders. Photographs. Testimonies from other survivors. Even a statement from the old diamond company before it collapsed, acknowledging that certain stones had gone missing but declining to pursue charges due to the circumstances of the Civil War. He spread the documents on the coffee table. Margaret and Thomas leaned forward, studying papers yellowed with age but still legible. The key document is this one, Howard said, pointing to a letter on official letterhead. It's from Samuel, written in '71, stating explicitly that the diamonds were given freely to Vincent in gratitude for saving lives. It's witnessed by 3 village elders and notarized by a missionary who was working in the area. Under international law, that makes them a legitimate gift. But the country doesn't exist anymore, Margaret said. Rhodesia became Zimbabwe. Does the law still apply? That's where it gets complicated, Howard admitted. You'll need lawyers who specialize in international estate law and precious stone transfers. It won't be simple. But Vincent was meticulous. He kept every receipt, every certification, every piece of paper that might prove the diamonds were legitimately his. That documentation now belongs to you. Thomas rubbed his face. This is overwhelming. We're nobody. We're 73 years old. We don't know anything about international law or diamonds or any of this. That's exactly why Vincent chose you, Howard said. You're not greedy. You're not corrupt. You're just honest people trying to do the right thing. That's more than most would be. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains rising in the distance. Somewhere up there, hidden behind a stone fireplace in a remote cabin, $250 million in diamonds waited for them to decide their fate. What would you do? She asked Howard. If they were yours. Howard was quiet for a long moment. I'd use them, he finally said. I'd use them to do what Vincent wanted to do but couldn't. I'd honor Samuel's gift by making it mean something, by transforming guilt into grace. What happens next will test everything Margaret and Thomas believe about honesty and courage, force them to choose between safety and justice, and prove that sometimes doing the right thing is the hardest thing of all. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. That evening, back at a motel in the nearest larger town, Margaret and Thomas spread out all the documents Howard had given them. Birth certificates, letters, photographs, appraisals, legal statements. Vincent had been preparing for this moment for decades, even if he'd never had the courage to face it himself. Margaret's phone rang. It was Rachel, calling for their nightly check-in. "Mom, are you both okay? You sound stressed." Margaret looked at Thomas, who nodded slightly. They'd agreed they needed to tell Rachel the truth, at least the basics. "Honey, we found something at the cabin. Something significant." "What kind of something?" "The kind that's going to change everything." Margaret took a breath. "There are diamonds hidden here. A lot of diamonds. Worth more money than we can even comprehend." Silence on the line. Then, "Mom, what are you talking about?" "Diamonds?" Margaret explained as simply as she could the hidden room. "The letters. Vincent's story." Rachel listened without interrupting. "Holy shit!" Rachel finally breathed. "Sorry, but holy shit, Mom. Are they real? 2P and P 25. Very real. And very complicated. Are you safe? I mean, if word gets out about this, that's one of our concerns," Thomas said, having moved close enough to speak into the phone. "Right now, only a handful of people know. We're trying to figure out the legal path forward before word spreads." "You need to come home," Rachel said firmly. "Pack up those diamonds or whatever, and come home where it's safe. You can figure out the legal stuff from here. We can't just transport them across state lines." Margaret said, "That could be illegal. We need to do this right. Then hire a lawyer. A good one. Don't try to handle this yourselves." After they hung up, Margaret felt exhausted. The weight of the discovery, the complicated emotions, the fear of making a wrong choice, it was all catching up with her. "Rachel's right," Thomas said. "We need a lawyer. Someone who knows about this stuff." They spent the next day making calls. Howard had given them names, attorneys who specialized in estate law, international trade, precious stones. Most were located in Denver, several hours away. The attorney they finally reached was named Patricia Anderson, a woman in her 50s with a reputation for handling unusual cases. When Thomas explained the situation in broad terms, there was a long pause. "Mr. Hayes, I'm going to be direct with you. What you're describing is extraordinary. Before I can agree to represent you, I need to see documentation, everything, and I need to verify some facts independently. Can you bring me copies of everything you've found?" "We can," Thomas said. "But you're worried about who to trust," Patricia finished. "I understand. Here's what I propose. Meet me in a public place. Bring copies only. Not originals. Let me review the materials. If I think I can help you, we'll discuss next steps. If not, I'll refer you to someone who can." They agreed to meet the following day at a coffee shop in Denver. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep again. She kept thinking about Vincent, alone in that cabin for 40 years, paralyzed by wealth he couldn't use. She thought about Samuel and his family, about the gift they'd given in gratitude. She thought about all the good that fortune could do, if only someone had the courage to use it. Around 3 in the morning, she heard raised voices outside their motel room. She moved to the window carefully and peeked through the curtain. 2 men stood by a pickup truck in the parking lot, arguing in low, intense voices. Margaret couldn't hear what they were saying, but something about their body language made her uneasy. One of them gestured toward the motel building. "Tom," she whispered. "Tom!" "Wake up!" He sat up immediately, alert to the urgency in her voice. "What's wrong?" "There are men outside. I might be paranoid, but something feels off." Thomas joined her at the window. The men were still there, one of them now on a phone. "Could be nothing," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. They watched for another 10 minutes until the men finally got in the truck and drove away. But sleep was impossible after that. They lay in bed with the lights off, listening to every sound, wondering if they'd made a mistake telling anyone about the diamonds, wondering if word had already spread farther than they'd intended. The next morning, they drove to Denver. Patricia Anderson met them at the coffee shop as arranged. She was professional, sharp-eyed, and after reviewing the copies of documents they'd brought, increasingly intrigued. "This is remarkable," she said, flipping through Vincent's meticulous records. "The level of documentation is extraordinary. Most people would have nothing like this." "So it's legitimate?" Margaret asked, hopefully, potentially. "The letters from Samuel and the elders are powerful evidence of a legitimate gift. The notarization helps. The company's statement declining to pursue charges is significant." She paused. "But there are complications. International asset transfer, especially stones that originated in a region with a complicated political history, requires extensive vetting. The IRS will want to know about this. Depending on how it's classified, inheritance versus found property versus gift, the tax implications could be substantial." "How substantial?" Thomas asked. "Potentially 40 to 50% of the assessed value." Margaret felt her stomach drop. 50% of $250 million was still an enormous fortune, but somehow losing half felt devastating. "However," Patricia continued, "there are legal structures we can use: trusts, charitable foundations, strategic distributions that could reduce that burden significantly. The question is, what do you want to do with these diamonds?" Margaret and Thomas looked at each other. "We don't know yet," Margaret admitted. "We're still trying to process that they're real and that they might actually belong to us." Patricia nodded. "That's fair. Here's my recommendation. Let me put together a team: a state lawyer, tax specialist, international trade expert, gemologist to do a proper appraisal. We verify everything, establish clear legal ownership, then discuss options. But I have to warn you, this process will take time. Months, possibly years. And once we start, people will find out. Diamonds of this value don't stay secret." "What about security?" Thomas asked. "The stones are still in the cabin. What if someone tries to steal them?" "We'll need to arrange secure transport and storage," Patricia said. "Professional vault facilities, insurance, guards if necessary. That's not cheap, but given what we're protecting, it's essential." Over the next several days, things moved quickly. Patricia assembled her team. A bonded transport company made the trip to the cabin and carefully moved the diamonds to a high-security vault in Denver. Each stone was photographed, weighed, catalogued. The gemologist's preliminary assessment confirmed what Howard had estimated: the collection was worth somewhere between $230 million and $250 million. The numbers still didn't feel real to Margaret. How could they? She and Thomas had spent their entire lives counting pennies. Now, they were counting millions. But with the mounting excitement came mounting complications. The first problem came from an unexpected source: Vincent's ex-wife. Margaret and Thomas were meeting with Patricia when her assistant interrupted with an urgent call. A woman named Diane Hayes was on the line, claiming to be Vincent's former spouse and demanding to know about his estate. "I didn't know Vincent was married," Margaret said. Patricia made some calls. It turned out Vincent had briefly married in the early 70s, right after returning from Africa. The marriage had lasted less than 2 years before Diane left, citing Vincent's emotional distance and refusal to communicate about his past. They'd divorced in 74. Now Diane, having heard through some network of gossip that Vincent's estate included something valuable, was claiming she was entitled to a portion. "Does she have a case?" Thomas asked. "Unlikely," Patricia said. "The divorce was finalized 50 years ago with a settlement agreement. She has no claim to property Vincent acquired after the marriage ended. But she can make noise, file suits, cause delays. It'll cost us time and money to fight her off." The second problem was worse. A man showed up at Howard's cabin in Summit Ridge, claiming to be a representative of the Zimbabwean government. He said he'd heard about a collection of diamonds that had originated in his country and demanded they be returned as national treasures. Howard called Margaret and Thomas immediately. "This guy's got official-looking documents, but something feels off. He's threatening legal action, international incidents, all kinds of drama." Patricia investigated. The man was legitimate. He did work for the Zimbabwean Cultural Ministry, but his authority to claim the diamonds was questionable. "This is where Vincent's documentation becomes crucial," Patricia explained. "The stones were given to him by private citizens, not stolen from the government or a mine. They were personal property, freely gifted. But proving that to a foreign government who wants them back will be complicated." The third problem was the most frightening. One evening, as Margaret and Thomas left Patricia's office, a car pulled up beside them. 2 men in suits got out. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, we need to talk about some stones you've acquired." Thomas instinctively moved in front of Margaret. "Who are you?" The men showed ID's Treasury Department, Division of Asset Recovery. "We're investigating possible money laundering and illegal diamond trading. We'd like you to come answer some questions." Patricia appeared at the office door. "My clients aren't going anywhere without me present. If you want to question them, schedule it through my office with proper notice." The men left. But the message was clear. The government was watching, investigating, possibly preparing to seize the diamonds. That night, back at their motel, Margaret broke down crying. "This was supposed to help us," she sobbed. "We thought we'd found something that would make our lives easier. Instead, it's turning into a nightmare. People threatening us, the government investigating us, lawyers eating up money we don't have." Thomas held her, his own fear barely contained. "Maybe we should just give it all up. Tell them to take the diamonds, go back to our apartment and our bills, and forget any of this ever happened." Margaret pulled back, wiping her eyes. "We can't. Vincent trusted us with this. Samuel and those families, they gave these stones because Vincent saved their lives. If we just hand them over to governments and bureaucrats and Vincent's greedy ex-wife, what does that say? That their gift meant nothing? But what if we can't win?" Thomas asked. "What if all our fighting just means we lose everything anyway? Plus, we've spent money on lawyers we can't afford." Margaret didn't have an answer. The next day, Patricia called an emergency meeting. Her team had been working around the clock, and they had news. "The Treasury investigation is based on a tip," Patricia said. "Someone told them you were moving diamonds illegally. We think it might be Diane, Vincent's ex, trying to create problems that might force you to settle with her. Can we prove that?" Thomas asked. "We're working on it. But here's the bigger issue. The Zimbabwean representative is gaining traction. He's gone to the media claiming that Vincent was a colonial exploiter who stole diamonds from his country. It's not true, but it's making headlines. Elderly couple hoards, fortune stolen from Africa, that sort of thing. Margaret felt sick. We're not hoarding anything. We're trying to do the right thing. I know, Patricia said gently, but perception matters. We need to get ahead of this story. We need to show the truth that Vincent was a hero who saved lives, that the diamonds were freely given, that you're trying to honor that gift responsibly. How? Margaret asked. Patricia laid out a plan. They would hold a press conference, present the documentation, tell Vincent's story publicly, bring Howard to testify, maybe even track down survivors of the people Vincent saved, if any were still alive. It's risky, Patricia warned. Once this story goes fully public, you'll have no privacy. Everyone will know about the diamonds, about you. There will be attention, scrutiny, people coming out of the woodwork with claims and demands. But if we don't go public, Thomas said, we let the false narrative stand. We let people think Vincent was a thief. Exactly, Patricia said. Margaret thought about Vincent, alone in his cabin for 40 years, hiding from a world that might judge him. He'd chosen silence and secrecy and isolation, and it had destroyed him slowly. One day at a time. We go public, she said firmly. We tell the truth. We trust that the truth matters. Thomas nodded. Agreed. Over the next week, Patricia's team prepared meticulously. They tracked down records from the old diamond company. They found archived news reports about the Civil War and the evacuation Vincent had led. They even located a man named Joseph Medluli, Samuel's grandson, now living in South Africa. Joseph confirmed everything. His grandfather had spoken often of Vincent Hayes, the white soldier who'd risked everything to save their village. The diamonds had been given freely, joyfully, as a sacred trust. My grandfather died in '87, Joseph said over a video call. But before he passed, he made me promise to tell Vincent's story if I ever got the chance. To make sure the world knew he was a good man who'd been punished by his own conscience for not being able to save everyone. Joseph agreed to come to Denver for the press conference. The night before the conference, Margaret couldn't sleep. Again. She'd barely slept in weeks. The stress was wearing her down, making her feel every one of her 73 years. What if this doesn't work? She asked Thomas in the darkness. What if we tell our story and no one believes us? What if they take the diamonds anyway? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Vincent spent 40 years hiding and being afraid. I don't want that to be our story. Whatever happens tomorrow, at least we'll have tried to do the right thing. At least we'll have been brave when it mattered. Margaret reached for his hand in the darkness. When did you get so wise? So, about 5 decades of being married to you, he said. It rubbed off. The press conference was held at Patricia's office. A dozen reporters showed up, cameras rolling, notebooks ready. Margaret and Thomas sat at a table with Patricia beside them. Howard was there. Joseph appeared via video link from South Africa. Patricia went first, presenting the documentation, letters from Samuel, testimonies from survivors, the company's statement, Vincent's meticulous records, photographs showing Vincent with the village families. Then Joseph spoke, his voice strong despite the video connection. He told stories his grandfather had shared, how Vincent had risked his life repeatedly, how he'd shared his own food with hungry families, how he'd driven through rebel-held territory under fire to get children to safety. The diamonds were not payment, Joseph said. They were gratitude, sacred gratitude from people who had nothing else to give. My grandfather would be heartbroken to know they've been locked away all these years, unable to do the good they were meant to do. Then it was Margaret's turn. She stood on shaking legs and told their story: the inheritance letter, the drive to Colorado, the discovery of the hidden room. She spoke about Vincent's letters, his guilt, his inability to use the gift he'd been given. "My husband and I are not wealthy people," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "We've spent our whole lives struggling to make ends meet. Finding these diamonds, it felt like a miracle. But we quickly realized it was also a responsibility. These stones represent lives saved, gratitude freely given, and one man's tragedy of being unable to forgive himself." She looked directly at the cameras. "We don't want to hoard this fortune. We want to use it the way Vincent should have used it, to do good, to honor Samuel and the families who gave these stones, to help people the way Vincent helped them. We're asking for the chance to do that. We're asking for justice, not just for us, but for Vincent's memory and for the people whose gift this truly was." The questions came rapid fire after that. Was the collection legal? What would they do with the money? Were they afraid of the Zimbabwean government's claims? Patricia fielded the legal questions. Margaret and Thomas answered the personal ones as honestly as they could. By the time it was over, Margaret felt drained, but she also felt something else: relief. The truth was out now. Whatever happened next, at least they'd told their story. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By that evening, the story was everywhere. News sites, social media, television. Most of the coverage was sympathetic. People were moved by Vincent's story, by Margaret and Thomas's obvious sincerity, by Joseph's testimony about his grandfather. But there was negative coverage too. Some accused them of trying to profit from colonialism. Others questioned why they hadn't immediately returned the diamonds to Zimbabwe. A few suggested the whole thing was a scam. The Zimbabwean official held his own press conference, demanding the diamonds be returned. Diane Hayes gave an interview claiming Vincent had always been troubled and unstable, implying the diamonds might not be legitimate after all. But something else happened too. People started reaching out, offering support. A law professor wrote an editorial explaining why the diamonds legally belonged to Margaret and Thomas. A historian specializing in African colonial history published a piece defending Vincent's actions. Descendants of other families Vincent had saved came forward with their own stories. The tide of public opinion began to shift in their favor. 3 days after the press conference, Patricia called with news. The Treasury has dropped its investigation. They reviewed all the documentation and concluded there's no evidence of wrongdoing. The diamonds are legally yours. Margaret felt her knees go weak. Really? Really? Now we still have to deal with the Zimbabwean claim and Diane's lawsuit. But those are civil matters, not criminal. You're not going to be arrested. The stones won't be seized. That night, Margaret and Thomas allowed themselves to feel hope for the first time since finding the hidden room. "We did it," Thomas said. "We told the truth, and it worked." "We haven't won yet," Margaret cautioned. "There's still a lot to figure out, but we're not criminals." "That's something," Margaret nodded. It was something. It was a lot, actually. As she lay in bed that night, she thought about the path that had brought them here. The inheritance letter, the winter drive, the hidden room, the diamonds glittering in the darkness. All of it had seemed impossible, terrifying, overwhelming, but they'd faced it anyway. 2 elderly people with no experience in any of this had stood up and fought for what was right. And they'd survived. Whatever came next, legal battles, complicated decisions about the fortune's future. The weight of that much wealth, they would face it together, just like they'd faced everything else for 51 years. The diamonds were no longer a secret. The burden was no longer theirs alone. And for the first time since opening that false wall, Margaret felt like she could finally breathe. The legal resolution came gradually, like snow melting in spring, slow at first, then suddenly rushing forward. Patricia's team worked tirelessly through the complexity of international law, estate regulations, and precious stone commerce. Margaret and Thomas waited, living in a modest hotel in Denver, their old apartment back home given up when they realized they wouldn't be returning to that life. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Joseph Madluli, Samuel's grandson, traveled from South Africa not just to testify, but to deliver something precious, his grandfather's journal. Written in careful English with occasional words in Ndebele, it documented everything: Vincent's rescue operation, the village elder's decision to give him the diamonds, and Samuel's own words about why the gift was sacred. "These stones are from our earth," Samuel had written in 1970, "given freely to honor a debt that cannot be measured in wealth." Vincent saved not just bodies but futures, children who would grow, families who would continue. The stones are nothing compared to this. They are simply all we had to give. Patricia presented the journal to the court, handling the various claims against the estate. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for cutting through nonsense, read the entire journal in one sitting. 2 weeks later, she issued her ruling. "The evidence is overwhelming," Judge Morrison said from the bench, her voice carrying the weight of careful deliberation. "These diamonds were freely given by their rightful owners to Mr. Vincent Hayes in gratitude for his actions, saving their lives. The subsequent transfer to Mr. and Mrs. Hayes through inheritance is legal and binding. The claim by the Zimbabwean government is denied. These stones were private property, not national treasures. The claim by Miss Diane Hayes is denied. She has no legal standing to contest an inheritance from an estate she divorced herself from 50 years ago." Margaret gripped Thomas's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. "However," the judge continued, "the court notes that this fortune comes with a moral weight as well as a legal one. These diamonds represent sacrifice, gratitude, and lives saved. The court trusts that Mr. and Mrs. Hayes will honor that legacy appropriately." She looked directly at them. "Don't waste this gift the way fear prevented Mr. Vincent Hayes from using it. Do better." The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them. Cameras flashed. Questions flew like birds, startled from branches. "What will you do with the money? Are you going to sell the diamonds? How does it feel to be worth over $200 million? Patricia shielded them, guiding them to a waiting car. But Margaret paused, turned back to the cameras, and spoke from her heart. "We're 73 years old," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "We spent our whole lives struggling, and now we've been given something extraordinary, not just wealth, but purpose. We're going to honor Vincent Hayes's memory and Samuel Madluli's gift by doing what they both would have wanted. We're going to help people." That night, in their hotel room, Margaret and Thomas sat surrounded by documents, financial projections, and charitable foundation papers. They'd been working with advisors for weeks, planning, dreaming, trying to figure out how to transform Vincent's hidden burden into something beautiful. "After taxes and legal fees," Thomas said, studying the papers, "we're looking at about $140 million in liquidated assets, plus the remaining stones as reserve holdings. Margaret shook her head in wonder. The numbers still felt impossible. Even after giving half to the government, we have more than we could spend in 10 lifetimes. So we don't spend it on ourselves, Thomas said. Not most of it. Anyway, they'd already decided on their personal allocation. 5 million would go to them, enough to live comfortably for the rest of their lives, to buy a real home, to never worry about bills again. It felt simultaneously like a fortune and like almost nothing compared to what they had. The rest would go to work. 20 million would establish the Vincent Hayes Memorial Foundation, dedicated to helping refugees and displaced families, honoring Vincent's original heroism. Another 20 million would create the Samuel Madluli Education Trust, providing scholarships for students from Zimbabwe and surrounding countries to attend universities worldwide. 15 million would go to Summit Ridge and the surrounding mountain communities, infrastructure improvements, medical facilities, economic development. The town that had been dying when they arrived would have a chance to thrive again. 10 million would support Rachel and her family, not as a handout, but as an investment. Donald could start the contracting business he'd always dreamed of. The grandchildren's education would be fully funded. Rachel could quit her second job and maybe, finally, breathe. And the cabin, Vincent's cabin, their inheritance would become something neither man had probably imagined. They would transform it into the Hayes Madluli Heritage Center, a place that told the story of what happened in Africa in 1968, of lives saved and gratitude given, of one man's struggle with survivor's guilt and another family's generous spirit. The remaining funds would seed other projects as they emerged: disaster relief, community development, small business loans for people who'd been told no by traditional banks. Margaret and Thomas would spend the rest of their lives giving away what they'd been given, transforming diamond stones into stepping stones for others. Rachel should be here for this, Margaret said, looking at the foundation papers waiting to be signed. She's flying in tomorrow, Thomas reminded her, with the whole family. The reunion happened at the Denver airport, and it was everything Margaret had hoped for. Rachel burst through the arrivals gate with tears already streaming down her face, followed by Donald and their 3 children, Emma, Jack, and Sophie, ages 15, 12, and 9. "Mom!" Rachel threw her arms around Margaret, holding her like she might disappear. "I can't believe this is real. I can't believe any of this is real." The grandchildren were wide-eyed, quiet, clearly coached by their parents to be on good behavior. But Sophie, the youngest, broke free and wrapped herself around Thomas's legs. "Grandpa, are you really millionaires now?" Thomas knelt down, wincing at his creaky knees, and looked into his granddaughter's eyes. "You know what, sweetheart? We're richer than we've ever been. Not because of money, but because we get to help people. That's the real treasure." Sophie considered this seriously. "Can you help my friend Maya? Her family doesn't have much money, and sometimes she doesn't bring lunch to school." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "Yes, honey, we can help Maya, and a lot of other people too." That evening, they gathered in a suite. Patricia had arranged a space big enough for all of them to sit together and talk. Margaret and Thomas explained everything: the inheritance, the discovery, the diamonds, the legal battles, and now the plans for what would come next. Rachel listened with tears running down her face. Donald kept shaking his head in disbelief. The children asked questions that somehow got to the heart of things faster than any adult conversation. "Was Vincent sad?" Emma asked. "Because he couldn't use the diamonds?" "Very sad," Margaret said gently. He let fear and guilt trap him. We don't want to make that mistake. Good, Emma said firmly. Being sad with a bunch of diamonds seems silly. You should do happy things with them, out of the mouths of babes. Margaret thought. They spent the next day signing papers, meeting with financial advisors, setting up trusts and foundations. Rachel and Donald would be involved in the foundation work if they wanted to be, not as employees, but as partners in deciding how to deploy the resources for maximum good. I can't accept this, Rachel said, when they explained the $10 million set aside for her family. Mom, Dad, you've already given me everything. You don't owe me. We're not paying a debt, Thomas interrupted. We're sharing a blessing. Please, sweetheart, let us do this. Let us see our daughter and grandchildren thrive while we're still here to witness it. Rachel sobbed then, really sobbed, releasing years of worry and stress and fear about money. Donald held her, his own eyes wet. Thank you, he whispered to Margaret and Thomas. You've saved us. No, Margaret said. Vincent saved people 50 years ago, and they gave him a gift. We're just passing it forward. That's all any of us can do, receive blessings and share them. The transformation of Summit Ridge began immediately. Patricia connected them with development consultants who specialized in rural revitalization. The first priority was healthcare. The nearest hospital was 2 hours away, and in winter, that distance could be deadly. They funded the construction of a modern medical clinic, staffed with doctors willing to practice in remote areas, in exchange for student loan forgiveness and generous salaries. The clinic would serve a 50-mile radius and include emergency services, primary care, and dental. The second priority was infrastructure. They invested in road improvements, updated the town's aging water system, and funded high-speed internet installation critical for attracting remote workers and businesses to the area. The third priority was economic development. They established a small business incubation program, providing grants and low-interest loans to locals wanting to start enterprises. A young woman opened a bakery. A retired carpenter started a custom furniture business. A couple turned an old building into a bed and breakfast for the tourists who were starting to trickle in. But the heart of it all was the cabin. The transformation took 6 months. They hired local contractors, including several whose businesses had been saved by the development loans, to carefully restore and expand Vincent's cabin while preserving its essential character. The original structure became a museum. Vincent's belongings were preserved, displayed with respect and context. His letters were framed and mounted. Photographs of him with Samuel and the village families lined the walls. The hidden room behind the fireplace was left open, empty now of diamonds, but full of story. The expansion added a visitor center, a research library, and a community gathering space. One wall was dedicated to telling Samuel's story and the history of the Rhodesian Civil War. Another honored all the people Vincent had saved, with photographs and names when they could be found, and simple acknowledgments when they couldn't. Joseph Medluli came for the opening, along with 3 other descendants of families Vincent had rescued. Together with Margaret, Thomas, Howard, and what seemed like the entire population of Summit Ridge and surrounding areas, they gathered on a bright October morning nearly a year after that first winter trip. The building was beautiful stone and glass and wood, traditional and modern at once, nestled against the mountains like it had always belonged there. Howard spoke first, telling Vincent's story with a steady voice despite his emotion. Vincent was my friend, and like all of us, he was imperfect. He saved lives, but couldn't save everyone. And that burden crushed him. But maybe that was never the point. Maybe the point was simply to do what you can, to act with courage when courage is needed, and to trust that your actions will ripple forward in ways you can't predict. Joseph spoke next, reading from his grandfather's journal. My grandfather wrote, "Vincent Hayes gave us tomorrow. That is worth more than all the diamonds in the earth." Today, we stand here because two people had the courage Vincent couldn't quite find. The courage to use a gift wisely, to honor a legacy properly, to believe that doing good is worth the risk and the struggle. Then it was Margaret's turn. She stood at the podium, feeling every one of her 74 years now, but also feeling stronger than she had in decades. My husband and I were 73 years old, poor and scared when we got the letter telling us about this inheritance, she began. We came here expecting nothing, or maybe expecting a burden we couldn't afford. Instead, we found a gift we didn't deserve, and a responsibility we didn't feel equipped for. She looked out at the faces, young and old, local and distant, people whose lives had already been touched by the foundations they'd established. Vincent Hayes spent 40 years paralyzed by the fear of doing the wrong thing. Thomas and I spent most of our lives paralyzed by poverty and the fear of not having enough. But somewhere in the process of uncovering Vincent's secret, we learned something important. The real poverty isn't having too little money. It's having too little courage to use what you've been given. Her voice strengthened. These diamonds, Samuel's gift, they were never meant to sit in darkness. They were meant to shine, to help, to transform lives the way Vincent transformed lives in 1968. We can't bring Vincent back or undo his years of suffering, but we can honor his legacy by doing what he should have done, by being brave. Of this time, the applause was thunderous. People stood, locals who'd known Vincent as the hermit in the mountains, descendants of those he'd saved, townspeople whose lives had been changed by the foundation's work. After the ceremony, Margaret and Thomas walked through the Heritage Center with Rachel and the grandchildren. Sophie read every plaque, asked 100 questions. Jack stared at the photographs of Vincent in Africa. Emma stood for a long time in front of the empty hidden room. "Grandma," Emma finally said, "do you think Vincent would be happy about all this?" Margaret considered carefully. "I think Vincent was too sad to be happy about much of anything. But I hope, wherever he is, he knows that his story didn't end in that lonely cabin. It transformed into something bigger and better than he could have imagined." That evening, back in the home they'd purchased in Summit Ridge, not a mansion, just a comfortable cabin with room for grandchildren to visit, Margaret and Thomas sat on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains. They'd come a long way from that cramped apartment with the failing radiator. They now had financial security beyond anything they'd dreamed. But more than that, they had purpose. Every day brought letters from scholarship recipients, reports from the medical clinic about lives saved, updates about businesses thriving in Summit Ridge. "Do you ever miss the old life?" Thomas asked. Margaret thought about it. "I miss the simplicity sometimes, when our biggest worry was stretching the grocery budget. But I don't miss the fear, the constant anxiety about money running out. The feeling that we were just waiting to become a burden to Rachel." "No," Thomas agreed. "I don't miss that either." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to emerge overhead. Millions of them, each one like a tiny diamond in the velvet darkness. "Tom, yeah, thank you for being crazy enough to make that trip. For insisting we see what Vincent left us, instead of just selling it sight unseen." Thomas reached for her hand. "Best decision I ever made." "Well, second best." Margaret smiled. She knew what was coming. First was asking you to dance 53 years ago. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. A van pulled up to their cabin, and out stepped a group of people Margaret didn't recognize. The leader, a woman in her 40s, approached with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm Dr. Jennifer Morrison. I'm the new director of the medical clinic you funded. I wanted to bring some people to meet you." The group came forward, a teenage boy with his mother, an elderly man, a young couple with a baby. "3 weeks ago, Doctor," Morrison said, "this young man, Tyler, had a burst appendix. Before the clinic, he would have died before reaching the nearest hospital. We saved his life." Tyler's mother was crying. "Thank you. I don't know what else to say. Just thank you." The elderly man spoke next. "I'm Nathan Green. I've lived in these mountains for 72 years. Had a heart attack last month. Your clinic's quick response saved me, gave me more time with my grandchildren." The young couple stepped forward, the mother holding her baby carefully. "This is Clara," the father said. "She was born premature, had complications. Dr. Morrison and her team kept her alive. She's thriving now, because of you." Margaret couldn't speak. Thomas's arm came around her shoulders, and she realized he was trembling too. "There are more stories," Dr. Morrison said softly. "Every day, there are more stories. You're not just saving lives with money, you're giving people futures." After they left, Margaret and Thomas sat in stunned silence. "Vincent saved about 300 people," Margaret finally said. "Now, through his gift, we're saving more, and the scholarships will save more by giving people education and opportunity. And the business loans will save more by letting people build lives with dignity. It multiplies," Thomas said, wonder in his voice. "The good just keeps multiplying." That principle, the multiplication of good, became their guiding philosophy. Every decision about the foundations, every grant awarded, every program funded, was evaluated not just on immediate impact, but on how it might ripple forward. The scholarship program evolved to include mentorship, pairing recipients with professionals in their fields. Those professionals then became donors themselves, inspired by the students they'd helped. The students, once graduated, began coming back to serve their communities, creating more opportunities. The small business program expanded to include business training and networking. The businesses began hiring locally, creating jobs, generating tax revenue that improved schools and services. Those improved services attracted more families, who started more businesses, creating a virtuous cycle. The medical clinic became a teaching facility, training rural healthcare providers who then started clinics in other underserved areas, spreading the model. It was exactly what Margaret had hoped for, not just spending money, but investing it in ways that would generate returns measured in human flourishing rather than dollars. 2 years after finding the diamonds, Margaret and Thomas attended a scholarship award ceremony at a university in Denver. 20 students from Zimbabwe, South Africa, and surrounding countries received full scholarships through the Samuel Mdluli Education Trust. One recipient, a young woman named Thandiwe, approached them after the ceremony. "My grandmother knew your Samuel," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "She was one of the children Vincent Hayes saved. She's 82 now, lives in Johannesburg. She wanted me to give you this." Thandiwe handed Margaret a letter, written in careful handwriting on thin paper. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, I am Precious Mdluli, Samuel's daughter, Thandiwe's grandmother. I was 7 years old when Vincent Hayes carried me through the bush to safety. I still remember his face, his kindness, The way he sang to calm us children when we were afraid. My father told me about the diamonds, about the gift the elders gave. He died believing those stones would never fulfill their purpose, because Vincent was too broken to use them. But now I see that perhaps they needed to wait for the right people. You have done what Vincent couldn't, and what my father dreamed of. You have turned stones into hope, wealth into blessing, one man's burden into countless people's opportunity. My granddaughter will become a doctor because of you. She will save lives. And perhaps someday, someone she saves will do something extraordinary that helps others. The good goes on and on, like ripples from a stone thrown into water. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for honoring my father's gift properly. Thank you for proving that sometimes the right people do find what they're meant to find, exactly when they're meant to find it. With gratitude and blessings. Precious Mdluli. Margaret read the letter aloud to Thomas that night, both of them crying openly. We did it, Thomas said. We actually did what we set out to do. We're not finished, Margaret said. We have years of work ahead, but we started something real. Something that matters. Margaret folded the letter carefully. Vincent and Samuel, they both gave us something precious. Vincent gave us the means. Samuel gave us the purpose. All we did was have the courage to put them together. The years that followed were full and rich in ways that had nothing to do with money. Margaret and Thomas split their time between Summit Ridge and traveling to see the programs they'd funded. They met scholarship recipients in Africa, visited small businesses in Colorado, attended ribbon cuttings for new facilities. They watched their grandchildren grow, supported now by educational trust funds, but more importantly by the example of generosity. Emma decided she wanted to work in nonprofits. Jack became interested in sustainable community development. Even little Sophie, now 12, talked about becoming a doctor like the ones at the clinic. Rachel and Donald thrived. The contracting business Donald started became the largest employer in the region. They hired locally, paid well, and funded their own scholarship program for kids interested in the trades. The fortune was being spent exactly as they'd intended, not hoarded, not wasted, but invested in human potential and community flourishing. On their 77th birthday, they'd been born 3 days apart, and always celebrated together. Margaret and Thomas returned to the cabin for a quiet day alone. The Heritage Center was closed for a private event, giving them space to reflect. They walked through the museum, looking at Vincent's story displayed on the walls. They stood in the empty hidden room, where diamonds had once waited in darkness. Do you have any regrets? Margaret asked. Thomas thought about it. I regret that we couldn't have found this 10 years earlier, 20 years earlier. Imagine how much more good we could have done with more time. But we found it when we found it, Margaret said. And we've done the best we could with what we were given. Do you regret it? Thomas asked. Any of it? Margaret shook her head. Not for a second. I regret the years we spent scared and small. But finding this, taking the chance, making the trip, digging behind that wall, that was the bravest thing we ever did. And look what it became. They walked outside as the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose. Summit Ridge bustled below them, no longer a dying town, but a thriving community with a medical clinic, good roads, new businesses, and hope. We were supposed to just sell this place, Thomas said. Take whatever money we could get, and limp through our final years a little less poor. Instead, we found a purpose, Margaret finished. We found out who we could be when fear didn't rule us anymore. She turned to him, taking both his hands. Thomas Hayes, you gave me the best years of my life. Not these last few with the money, but all of them. Every penny pinching, bill juggling, stress-filled year. Because we faced them together. The money just gave us the chance to show what we were capable of when circumstances finally matched our courage. Thomas pulled her close, holding her the way he had for 54 years now. I love you, Maggie. For richer or poorer. Remember, turns out we got both, she said. Spent most of our lives poor. Now we're rich. But you know what? You were right there beside me through all of it. That's the real treasure. As darkness fell, they sat on the porch of Vincent's cabin, their cabin watching stars emerge. Somewhere in Denver, scholarships were being awarded. Somewhere in Summit Ridge, the clinic was saving a life. Somewhere in Africa, a student funded by the Mdluli Trust was studying to become a teacher. The diamonds Vincent had hidden for 40 years were finally doing what they were always meant to do, shining light into darkness, creating opportunity where there had been despair, proving that gifts, freely given and courageously used, could change the world. Margaret thought about the journey that had brought them here. An inheritance letter, a winter drive that should have been impossible, a hidden room discovered by courage and curiosity, a legal battle fought with truth and determination, and finally, the decision to use their unexpected fortune not to escape their past, but to transform other people's futures. Vincent would be proud, Thomas said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. I hope so, Margaret said. I hope he knows his burden became a blessing, that his paralysis ended when we found the courage he couldn't quite reach. They sat in peaceful silence as the night deepened around them. They were 77 years old now, their time on earth growing shorter with each passing day. But they'd lived more in these past 3 years than in all the decades before. They'd been poor and learned to survive. They'd been given wealth and learned to serve. They'd found diamonds and discovered purpose. They'd inherited a cabin and built a legacy. And somewhere in it all, 2 frightened elderly people counting pennies had transformed into something they'd never expected to be. Heroes of their own story, guardians of someone else's dream, and proof that it's never too late to be brave. Anyone can transform a burden into a blessing if they're willing to face their fears, trust in truth, and believe that doing good matters more than playing safe. Because sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in what we keep, but in what we give away. And sometimes the richest lives are built not on what we own, but on how many others we help along the way. As dawn broke over the mountains the next morning, casting light across the Heritage Center and the thriving town below, Margaret and Thomas began another day of work. There were foundation meetings to attend, grant applications to review, lives to change. They'd spent decades dreaming of a comfortable retirement, of finally having enough. Instead, they'd been given abundance and discovered that enough was never just about money. It was about purpose, connection, legacy, love. The girl who'd sorted bills with arthritic fingers, and the man who'd delivered mail until his back broke, had become something neither had imagined possible. Architects of hope, builders of dreams, and living proof that courage doesn't have an age limit. Because for Margaret and Thomas Hayes, the fortune hidden behind a stone fireplace hadn't been the end of their story. It was where everything truly began. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that integrity, courage, and generosity can turn even the darkest secrets into light that guides others home.